Okay guys, welcome back to our next part in the video series. So what I'm actually going to touch into now is biochemical individuality, and then I'll get into the story about metabolic typing. So whenever I give a talk on nutrition, one of the first things I always say is, listen, there is no one diet, no one nutritional lifestyle protocol or diet that will suit every single human being on this planet. And to think that way is illogical. Every single person is biochemically unique. Every single person is nutritionally unique. Okay, so therefore everyone's nutritional requirements are unique. Okay, we are all different. Now there are some general guidelines you can give to someone given where their ancestry is from and what part of the world that they live in and grew up in and whatnot. I'll get into that a little later on. But just so we know, everyone is biochemically unique. Okay, whereas we're just as unique on the inside as we are on the outside. Okay, just like our fingerprints are unique to each individual. So the story that we're going to get into now about metabolic typing, we'll start with Weston A. Price first of all. Okay, so Dr. Weston A. Price was a dentist. He travelled the world in the 1930s, and Dr. Weston Price's book is called Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. A fantastic read, one of my top nutrition books, and I've actually read that book cover to cover. It's a pretty dense read, but it's a very interesting book. Essentially, Dr. Price travelled the world and studied and lived with the following tribes. Okay, he lived with the Swiss in a valley in Switzerland. He also lived with the Gaelics of Scotland, the Eskimos, the North American Indians. He studied and lived with the Malaysians and Polynesians, so islands in the Pacific Sea. He went to Africa and studied some of the African tribes, Australian Aborigines, some islands outside the coast of Australia like the Torres Strait Islanders, ancient civilizations of Peru, where he examined the skulls of the ancient civilizations there. The New Zealand Maori and Peruvian Indians. Essentially what Dr. Price was initially interested in was the dental health of these primitive people. Apparently he was told in dentistry school, oh, you know, we're so lucky to have dentistry in the Western world because primitive people just go insane with toothaches and pain, and some even kill themselves. And you know, he was like, I don't know if I really buy that. So in the 1930s, you know, aviation was only really, you know, around properly just around that time, like, and he travelled the world to all these different primitive tribes, and he just wanted to study their dental development. So he wanted to see, you know, the breadth of their dental arches, the cavity count in their teeth. But then not only did he start to become he started to become even more interested in their physical and mental and emotional health and robustness. He was just amazed. So what he discovered was that once all of these primitive cultures he discovered that all these primitive cultures had very varied nutritional lifestyles, but they all had abundant health physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Okay, so they all had very varied nutritional lifestyles, again going back to biochemical individuality, but they all had abundant health. But the one underlying theme that connected all of these primitive tribes together was that all of their food came from Mother Nature. That should be the one underlying theme that connects every single dietary protocol together, is that the vast majority, if not all of that food, should come from Mother Nature. Okay, so if I just go back to my back slide here, so if you were to look at the Swiss, for instance, the Swiss ate a lot of raw dairy, had raw butter, they fermented grains. The Gaelics had a lot of fish in their diet and wild oats. The Eskimos had a very, very high saturated fat diet. They ate a lot of fish and fermented fish, seal, oleander oil. Their macronutrient ratio was essentially 80% saturated fat, 19.5% protein, and like 0.5 to 1% carbohydrates. They used to get some berries in the kind of warmer times of their climates. Say like the Malaysians and Polynesians, people off the Pacific Islands, very different now to what I've just spoken about in regards to the Eskimos, the Gaelics of Scotland and the Swiss. They had a very high plant-based and tropical fruit diet, but they still ate a lot of fish and they still ate some wild boar. So they still had animal products in their nutrition, in their diet, in their nutritional lifestyle. The African tribes, the Maasai, of course, are the most famous ones everyone talks about with Dr. Weston A. Price. They had a very high saturated fat diet too, but their saturated fat diet came in the form of raw milk from cows. They also used to drink blood from the jugular vein of the cow. They did eat some meat, not too much, but they did eat a lot of plants, tubers, and some fruits as well. The Australian Aborigines, there was inland Aborigines, and then there was coastal Aborigines. The inland Aborigines ate more kangaroo and insects and tubers and fruit and plants and stuff like that. The coastal ones ate more sort of sea life, seafood, ate a lot more fish and whatnot, but still had a lot of tubers and tropical fruit in their nutritional lifestyle and in their diet. I prefer saying nutritional lifestyle than diet. I think diet just has really bad condemnation or something. But anyway, by saying nutritional lifestyle or diet, I mean the same thing essentially. So you could see that with all these primitive tribes that Dr. Wesley Price studied, went to live with and studied with, you could see that they had very, very nutritional diets. But the one underlying thing was that all of their food came from Mother Nature. Now the next very important thing was that the health of these primitive tribes deteriorated rapidly once the food of modern man, or the food of modern commerce, like food from Western man, was introduced to their traditional diets. So things like sugar and vegetable oils and confectionery and, you know, just basically processed food. When that processed food got introduced into these primitive cultures' diets, eventually what happened was their health deteriorated rapidly. Tooth decay became a very common thing, which before that was not common at all. And even mentally, emotionally, and physically, they started to deteriorate. Some tribes started to experience depression and suicide that was never there in the generations before that. But the most interesting thing was the health of the offspring was also greatly compromised with the introduction of these processed foods within one generation. So what do I mean by that? Essentially what I mean is that if I was a man brought up in my traditional diet, and then I got married to a wife who was also brought up in her traditional diet, and then we decided to start eating these processed foods, and then my wife got pregnant, the health then of our child, you know, particularly physically, with regards to just overall body structure, was completely inferior to any generation that had come before my son or daughter, whatever the sex of the child may be. And that was in one generation of the introduction of this food. So that again goes back to something called epigenetics, how the environment shapes our genetic expression. So by just changing our nutrition, or the ratio, or the quality of our nutrition, would have an effect then on how healthy our child was. And that's what happened with these primitive people. By changing the quality of their diet, it had a huge effect on the health of their offspring then. Again, going back to epigenetics. Epigenetics is essentially how the environment dictates your genetic expression. And again, the biggest environmental influences on your health are your nutrition, circadian rhythms, and environmental toxins, your mental, emotional, and spiritual health, and exercise. Now, the next video I'll continue on this story. So if you're finding this interesting, check out the next part.